Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And we're live. Hey,
All
Jacob.
right. All right. Hey Morgan.
How are
Hey
you?
Morgan. I'm good. How are
I'm
you?
good. How are
Doing
you?
great.
Why did we
So
why did we
so
gather here at this hour?
yeah, so we're
Yeah, so we're
gathering.
gathering.
Honestly,
Honestly,
so yeah, so the point of
the
these
point
meetings,
of
I
these
guess, is
meetings,
to
I
kind
guess,
of
is
just
to kind
like
of just
be
like
fully
be fully
transparent about our
transparent about our
conversations.
conversations.
So we
So
didn't come into
we
this
didn't come into this
prepared at all.
prepared at
We just kind
all.
of
We
opened
just
up
kind of
our
opened up
previous
our previous
conversation,
conversation,
and we're just gonna,
and we're just gonna,
start talking
start
and see
talking
where we
and
end
see
up.
where we end up.
And the point is
And
that,
the point
for
is that,
anyone
for
listening
anyone
in, you
listening
can
in, you can
comment
comment
and give advice or
give
whatever it
advice or
is.
whatever it
We're
is.
really
We're
just
really
going with the
just
flow
going with
here.
the flow
No
here.
pun
No
intended.
pun
So,
intended. So,
we're just going to start
we're just
by
going to
talking
start
about
by talking about
contract
contract
metadata.
metadata.
We were having
We
a
were
pretty
having
good
a
discussion
pretty
about
good
that
discussion about that
during the last
during the
Hyperverse
last
planning
Hyperverse
committee.
planning committee.
I think
I
a
think
week
a
from
week from
maybe 3 days
maybe
ago.
3 days ago.
Um, and
Um,
we had just come up
and we
with
had just come up with
some contracts
some
to kind
contracts
of
to kind
represent
of
contract
represent
metadata.
contract
And
metadata.
yeah, let's just
And yeah,
kind
let's
of
just
dive back
kind of
into it.
dive back into it. All right.
So
So
where we left
where we
off
left off
was,
was
I'm actually kind
I'm
of
actually
taking a look
kind
at
of
this
taking a look at
again,
this again
for myself
for
here, but
myself here, but
it looks like
it
what we
looks like what
had
we had
was
was
this sort of
this sort
model
of
where we
model
had like
where
a
we had like a
primary
primary
export. So this was
export.
like
So
a
this was like a
contract where
contract
if
where
you were to go
if
into
you
a
were to go into a
module, you
module,
would read
you would
all the
read
module
all the module
metadata from this
metadata from
primary
this
export.
primary export.
And this primary
And this
export would
primary
also have
export
like
would
the
also
main
have like the main
functionality of
functionality of
whatever
whatever
dependent contracts
dependent
you had,
contracts
right?
you had, right?
Um,
Um,
and then
and then
we also had these
we
things
also had
called
these
like
things called
secondary
like
exports,
secondary
but that's
exports,
beside
but
the
that's
point for
beside
now,
the
and we'll
point for
worry
now,
about
and
that
we'll worry
later.
about that later.
Um,
Um,
so it looks
so
like
it looks like
what we were
what
talking
we
about
were
before
talking about
was
before
this
was
sort of
this sort of
primary export
primary
and the
export, and the
metadata they would have to
metadata they would
define
have to define
is in
is in
Hyperverse
Hyperverse
module dot module
module
metadata.
metadata.
So
So
that's really coming
that's
from
really
here.
coming from here.
So when we think
So
about
when we think
module
about
metadata,
module
we were
metadata,
thinking,
we were
okay, maybe it
thinking,
has a
okay, maybe it has
title,
a
there's a list
title,
of
there's a list of
authors,
authors,
and an
and
author
an
is
author is
just
just
an
an
address,
address,
like a chain
like a
native
chain native
address,
address,
some external
some external
metadata, right? So
metadata,
maybe
right? So
this
maybe
has,
this has,
I don't know,
I don't know,
maybe inside this
maybe inside
external
this
metadata,
external metadata, there's,
addresses
addresses
on other chains.
what do you think? And by the way, are you just recapping, or this is something where we start getting into the bones of it?
Oh, both. I
Oh,
mean,
both. I mean,
this could really be
this could
whatever.
really be
Like I'm kind
whatever.
of
Like I'm kind of
overviewing, but
overviewing,
if
but
we want to
if we
change
want to
stuff or
change stuff
whatever,
or
let's do
whatever,
it.
let's do it. Um, Obviously, privacy came up as a concern that time, and I want us to sort of we essentially like discussed two options. One was storing the address of the author in some external URL, and that's it. Now, the
Hmm.
author
Hmm.
would own that external URL, and depending on what kind of format would be agreed upon, there we would store things like username, name, and whatever. So the optionality would be like by default, everyone's anonymous,
Hmm. Hmm.
and optionally, they can provide as much identifying information as they want, emails, whatever. But that's not for us to decide what's required.
Great. I like
Great,
that.
I like
So
that. So,
are we thinking
are
let's
we
just
thinking let's
get rid
just
of these
get rid of
for
these
now,
for
and we'll
now,
keep
and we'll
external
keep
and
external
address?
and address? Yeah.
I like that.
I like
So
that. So,
one of the things I was
one of the
thinking
things I
about a
was
little
thinking
bit
about a little
was,
bit was,
when you go to
when you
that
go to that
Hyperverse search,
Hyperverse
right?
search, right?
And you're kind of like
And you're kind of
looking
like looking
for,
for,
um,
um,
stuff, and like let's say
stuff,
you
and like
type
let's say
into
you
the
type
input
into
field
the
like
input field like
NFT, and it brings up
NFT, and
all
it
these
brings up all
NFT
these
modules.
NFT modules.
One of the things I
One
was
of the
thinking
things I was
about
thinking
was,
about was,
what if you wanted
what if
to
you wanted
find
to
modules
find modules
dependent on
dependent
an
on an
author,
author,
how would
right? So
that
how would
work?
that work?
So if I typed in
So if I
like
typed in
Jacob
like
Tucker,
Jacob Tucker,
what would
like
come
what
up?
would come up?
And that's why I
And
think
that's why I think
a
a
username
username
would be cool in
would
the
be
sense that,
cool in
like,
the sense
because
that, like,
obviously if you ever looked up
if you ever
Jacob
looked up
Tucker,
Jacob Tucker,
there's like a billion
Jacob
Jacob
Tuckers
Tuckers
out
out there.
there.
But if I
But
looked
if
up
I
a
looked up a
username that's like
username
unique
that's like
to
your
your identity in
identity in
Hyperverse, and
Hyperverse, and
it would come up with
it
a
would
list of
come up
that.
with a
So
list of that.
are
So
we thinking
are
that
we thinking that
maybe what
maybe
it'll do
what
is
it'll do is
go
it'll
through
go
all the
through all the
modules, go to the
modules, go to the
external,
external,
or how will that
or
work?
how will
Yeah.
that work? Yeah. Well, any kind of search functionality would deploy caching, and the process of going through everything that's available through external links would be a part of that caching process. and it would just store that data someplace that's quickly accessible, so not on the blockchain, just for caching purposes. And then it will look up through those caches things like, obviously we might define a standard that could be in the external data. So for example, we could say external links must point to a JSON document. In that JSON document, you provide a name, like an alias, as a requirement, or not even as a requirement, like as an optional thing. And then let's say alias is an optional thing, then we have name as an optional thing, then we have whatever Twitter handle as an optional thing. The search engine would look up, see if there's an alias defined. If yes, then I'll add that to the index. If there's a Twitter handle defined, then I'll add that to the index. But it would not require anything.
Yep. I like that. And while you were talking about that, I also just was thinking like, well, on too, like your identity is represented by your address too, right? So instead of having this whole username functionality, which we could definitely have, we're already requiring that they put their native address on, and that seems more like native to blockchain anyway. So instead of having to look up like key snake Jake as you just look up an address. There's the authors module. So
Jacob,
that's really cool. That's really cool. I like
BZ
that.
mentioned, and I guess Dean mentioned, and BZ agreed. There's an echo on your end, I believe. Do you have headphones you could put on?
I do have these headphones in. That's weird.
Okay. I have headphones on myself. There are a few people listening in, so we want to make this recording as good as possible. What?
Hello. Okay, is this any better? I took out my head. Maybe this will be better.
Testing 1 2 3. Is this any better? Let us know. Real quick.
Testing. Is my audio bad?
Still doing it. All right. So that didn't do it. You might as well plug your headphones in. I'll open up the feed on my end. So Dean is saying I'm fine. Who's fine? Is it Morgan or is it Jacob that's with the echo? This is a similar setup that we had for developer hours. So
yeah.
This is a similar setup that we had for developer hours. So
yeah.
Okay, I think I know what it is. I will. Okay, this should fix it.
All right, testing.
Who is Jacob?
Testing.
Who is Jacob and who is Morgan? Dean is asking. So I'm Morgan. I'm waving right now. My name is Morgan, and Jacob.
And I am Jacob, waving right now.
All right, I think we fixed it. Thanks, guys. Thanks for really awesome for helping. Much better.
Is it better?
Yeah, perfect. It's working now.
Nice. Okay, so
fixing problems.
Yeah, so to kind of recap what we were just talking about, what would go in this author struct. And the last thing I was saying before we stopped was that, I was talking about, like, if you wanted to type into that search field, like a username or something, for like author discoverability, I also just realized that, we're requiring this on-chain address anyway. So if you wanted to just look up an author, you could just do it by their address. And then, it would also just give you a bunch of stuff there. So this is cool. And I think that this is definitely a good start. And
it's not overbearing on what needs to be there.
Yeah.
Which is the key thing. Like, we want to be opinionated in some things and some things maybe not. Plus, extensibility, right? When we ship this will be like immutable once it's live. this external hatch provides us with the ability to add extra things that might not be there. So yeah, I think this is plenty to start.
Yeah, I like it. And plus, one thing to keep in the back of our minds here is that, this is also going to be like similar to how we do this on Ethereum and all these other blockchains. So it's important to keep things like almost as minimal as possible so that it's not difficult to replicate it elsewhere. All right, cool.
So we have authors.
So we have a list of authors. We have a version. This is just like a version of the contract, which I like. That's good.
We should signify that this is following some kind of a versioning format. And I think, at least my suggestion would be to use SEMVer, SEMVER, semantic versioning.
Like that?
Yeah. So that's the number, period, number, so three numbers separated by periods. So it's like the...
Oh, yeah. So you're saying like
0.0.1, for example, would be like...
Yeah.
Without the V.
Okay.
Cool. So the first number indicates the major version. The middle one indicates a minor. So a major version has breaking changes. A minor version has full compatibility with the previous one, whereas the last one is like a bug fix. So, simple system, and it's widely used.
Cool. So then we have a published at, and I'm assuming this is going to be some sort of like timestamp, right?
Right. So I think we can define it as Unix timestamp with millisecond precision. So like JavaScript date, essentially.
So a Unix timestamp. Let me look this up. Okay, so it's like an amount of seconds. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the amount of seconds but a Unix timestamp with millisecond precision. So like MS, if you were to add that, would be great.
Yeah.
Your video's out for some reason. Like video as in your face.
Is it?
Yeah.
I didn't touch it.
Well, as long as I can hear you, that's good enough.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I'll keep checking Discord just in case anyone's like, oh, I can't hear you, whatever. But okay. So the published out would be like a Unix timestamp. That's good. And then external. So this is just a similar like external hash for the metadata. So if we want to, I guess, like add any other metadata at other points in time, or whoever created this module can add whatever they want, right? So this is like video description, a longer description, whatever they want. And this whole thing is where we'll get into like off-chain metadata at some other point. And that's like a whole separate discussion.
Yeah.
So, then the fee structure, I think, like at least for an MVP, we don't have to get too crazy about the fee structure. Plus, I know that Nick was against like.
So maybe we just
remove
this completely. It might be considered a distraction at the moment if we're not.
Sure. I like that. Yeah, and
there's a subtype.
Yeah.
Get rid of that too.
Yep. So we can just we can focus on like what are the requirements needed to get us to like a simple discoverability / search thing. Okay. So secondary modules. This was like the whole thing on secondary exports. And I think this will be like a big discussion as well, because where we left it off was we were just kind of saying like, every module will have a primary export and then there'll be secondary exports, but it gets a little nuanced when you start thinking about like cadence restrictions and just like how access control works in cadence. And also this is something to think about in terms of like Solidity, like how will that work although I don't have too much experience with Solidity, and I know you probably know better than me, Morgan, but it's certainly possible in Solidity, right, where you have some sort of primary contract that reads from other contracts, and they can each abide by, their own interfaces and stuff like that.
Well, this is not that. This is more like having constituent contracts that also have some value in external use. So like a Solidity example would be, but I'm not sure if it's even worth discussing. But most of the ERC or all of the ERC20 contracts, which is just a token standard, have a thing called safe math as part of the contract. So like multiplication, addition, subtraction, that's like every single contract has those lines of code in there.
Yep.
So it's like it would be like a really great secondary module, but if everyone does it like that, maybe it's I don't like, I would need to dig into Solidity more to be able to say anything with any kind of certainty.
Yeah.
But within Flow, it does make sense. And that example does work. So like an ERC20 equivalent token contract on Flow would have, let's say Flow didn't have all the wraparound math. And we needed to implement that ourselves. In that case, that could be a secondary module, and this would be an array, an optional array, where it would contain the entry point CDC file to that contract.
Yep. Yeah. So. So good point. So let's just go through like these remaining three, and then we'll kind of get into like how that primary export will work.
Tell you what, we should make a comment over above the secondary modules, because up to this point we're sort of outlining our thoughts, and this would be just like nil or array of .cdc files.
Yeah. Okay. So. Then in terms of license, this is like an MIT license or stuff like that. Just basically describing like how this would be used or copyrighted and etc.
Yeah, although you have a typo there for license.
Oh, license, is that right?
Yep.
Or is it license?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
SE. Yeah.
Cool.
So this is probably MIT or Berkeley or whatever, but I wonder. Unfortunately, the person that came up with this is not here, but
it was Hui, right? That suggested this.
It was Hui.
Yeah.
So, like obviously, what is this? Is this a link, or is this just a name, an identifier? Maybe this is a custom license that someone creates, like with a lawyer or something.
Yeah. So is there like an MIT license document out there, or like a Berkeley license document? Like I'm curious how that works, because I've seen this on like GitHub repositories and stuff like that, and I wonder what the standard is.
So GitHub Docs has an article on licensing a repository. For your repository to truly be open source, you'll need to license it so that others are free to use, change, and distribute the software. There's a choosealicense.com, and you sort of, there's like a few options there. And there's a community option, there's an MIT option, and there's a GNU option. And let's say we pick community, and then it has some examples like the Apache license, ISC license, and once you look into that, all right, so I'm gonna copy a link over. Let's see, Discord.
Yep, I see that.
So this is an example in the chooselicense.com. This is like a Apache license 2.0. This contains the entire license, and it highlights, which is a cool thing, it highlights what's permitted, what's conditional, and what's limited.
I like it. So maybe instead of like a string, maybe we make a struct called license, and we have the name and then a link to the license.
Yeah, I think a string though is kind of like an external, right? Where we provide a link to some place that then spits out a JSON that could have all of those things. But um, maybe it should be
Yes.
embedded. I don't know. Like, here's an open question. This is something maybe for the planning committee. Uh, not this fast-paced one, but like the one on Fridays.
Yeah.
Um, do we just provide an option where they can pick one of the three licenses, like the Apache, the MIT, or the GNU license, or do we make it open?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was gonna ask next. Is like when these we'll have to come up with some sort of system where whoever creates a module is obviously gonna have to submit it for review, and we still haven't talked about or even like begin to think about like how that submission process will work. But it might be something to discuss where when you are submitting that module, whether it be a form or a dAppster project or whatever, there will be options like Apache license, MIT license, Berkeley, and you simply select one, and then it puts it in for you. Because if you allow people to, well, that's option one, right? And then option two is like you allow people to put in their own licenses, but then we might have to make a requirement that you provide some sort of link or some whatever to the license itself, so that you're not just putting in like poop license and then expecting people to know what that means.
Yeah. But if we only had three options, right? Maybe then it's
Yeah.
like a drop down thing.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So maybe it's like maybe this is even like a drop down of three different licenses. How do you spell
Burke
Apache?
E, and then yeah.
Yeah.
And then we mentioned this chooselicense.com. So let's get rid of the line 34, and I think this covers it until, and add a comment that this is an open question. What's
Yeah.
the format? On YouTube, Harry is asking, you guys discussed on architecture already and then started this session because that would help us to understand the background of this session. So Harry, we did discuss a tiny bit on the background, but in essence, this is a rapid fire Hyperverse planning committee with me and Jacob just iterating on code. And then Fridays, we open it up to like a point by point discussion to all of the Hyperverse committee members. But right now the goal is sort of to put things into code so that it's open up for comments. But if you have any comments with regards to what you're seeing on the screen, we appreciate any and all feedback.
Yeah, and so like specifically, this is tying to like the contract metadata aspect of this Hyperverse. So essentially, like, what are the ways in which discoverability will be like how will contract developers implement contract metadata to allow discoverability on some front end or UI or whatever it may be. Yeah.
Alrighty. So then the reviewed Boolean flag. It seems like a Boolean is insufficient here.
Well, this also could be like, I guess like one also separate discussion like that I'm thinking in my head now is like, at what point do these become like actually needed in this metadata struct, and at what point are they external? Like,
I would say license would be a great candidate for external even.
I think so too.
Because it has no effect on how these things are consumed if they're consumed as a Hyperverse module, meaning they don't live in your source code, they live in the Hyperverse. You're just sort of leveraging that. The license applies to the source code, right? But I don't know. Maybe this is something that we could elaborate on. But the reviewed part has an effect on the Hyperverse, wherein if a module is not reviewed, then maybe we don't monetize it. Like it potentially has direct effects on the consumption of this module, whereas license would not, I would think.
Yeah, and similarly, like version and publish that. I don't. Is that directly necessary for anything in the source code either?
So version and publish that uniquely identify this thing because a collection of title, version, you can set the same title and you can set the same version, but someone published it first. So that's like you can spoof external metadata if you want, but the published at date is going to live there forever. So if you're the first one that published Flappy Bird module, then that's proved in the blockchain record.
Yeah. Yep. Good point. So maybe license is external, reviewed. So you were thinking maybe it's not a bool, and why is that?
Well, a review is like we're not going to have just a single review. Like multiple people can input their opinions, and maybe some reviewers are better, some are worse. So maybe this is an array of structs. So it could be like instead of reviewed, it could be reviews, and that array holds reviews. Type review. And each review would have a reviewer, and it would have we could start with something as simple as passed, a Boolean did pass review, so a specific reviewer marked it as passing, and then the system can take that into account. If a second reviewer comes in and marks it as not passing, then maybe we override the first reviewer. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think like the main point of like this reviews, right, like you were saying earlier, is if it's not quote unquote like reviewed and it failed some check, which we should talk about, then then like XYZ happens, right? Like it's not monetizable, it's not safe. Maybe there's even like something on the front end UI that shows like a red box and it's like, be careful, this is not reviewed or something like that. So the question is like, at what point does this fail that check, right? What is the check? And maybe it's that like 75% of these reviews have some passing indication or whatever that number may be. Because there will need to be some sort of like what's the word? Goal to get to in order for this module to cross that line of being like, this is safe to use and this is monetizable and whatnot. So, and maybe there are different check marks, right? Like maybe at like, if you collect all these reviews together and maybe at like 50%, it's, safe to use, but it needs to be like 80% in order to be monetizable, something like that, right?
Could be an interesting mechanic. Although I was thinking, so you submit a specific contract with a specific version, let's say version 1.0. You get a reviewer that reviews it as non-passing. So like your contract fails a specific review. Then maybe we shoot for 100%. If you don't get 100% reviewal rate, then we remove the monetization and you have to submit a new version that gets an empty review array that then can be populated with fresh reviews. What do you think?
Yeah, so then the question is like, who is actually allowed to review, right? True. Because some troll could come in and just start saying no. So then what's like the benchmark for reviewing? So
well, it would have to be a trusted member of the community, like a vetted, trusted member. And maybe this is not as heavy as auditing. Maybe this is like I executed this code and I runs well. Thanks for joining, Dean.
Yep.
We'll catch you next time.
Bye, Dean.
when you think about like what's a review, like even going back to what's the criteria for a review to pass?
Yeah, and I think honestly, like I think this discussion also like is very deeply like related to like that auditing layer,
Yeah.
because like, and that's something that Chase and other members of the team are trying to figure out. So maybe it's best to like I think it's probably best to leave the exact logistics, like percentages of whatever in there, and just have this be sort of like what was like the end decision. So the end decision was. I don't know, like just off the top of my head, like maybe it's just like, okay, this is good, this is okay and bad, or something like that, and we'll leave like the how that decision was made up to the team, and we'll kind of delay that a little bit.
So are you saying we should, for now, eliminate reviews and focus on other parts?
Yeah, I think this is something to come back to. And
Okay.
I think you're right. I definitely think it's not a Boolean. I think it'll end up being, it's going to be very complicated. It'll probably be, like you said, an array of reviews, whatever. But this is probably something that's more suited for whoever's like trying to tackle that auditing problem. And then once they come up with that system, we'll, put that on here. So
So, but
we'll leave.
um, if we're deferring this decision to a later point, we should probably get rid of that variable, because what we're thinking of is how do we ship this,
Yep,
right? And
you're
if
right.
there's a placeholder, then we can't ship it.
Yep, you're right.
Going back to tags, then
This could be,
external 100%.
yeah, this is definitely external. I agree. So let me put that up here. You know, we had like tags, we had a license, right? So we'll leave the license to that,
Yeah,
right? Okay, so
we just need this comment in there.
yeah,
Okay.
okay. Okay, so we'll get rid of the tags and license. That's fine. Okay. All right, cool. So this is pretty good for now. We'll leave this for a sec here. Um, okay, so there's a lot of other stuff to talk about, one of which being if we take a look at like our actual contract here, so this is like a Hyperverse subscription contract, and this is a little confusing, and it might not be worth like going over exactly what this contract is doing, but essentially it's just like a sample contract that I had written to handle like subscriptions, right? And during the Fast Forward Bootcamp, we kind of like introduced this whole tenant architecture. And I guess I'll ask like upfront, like, are you at least like familiar with like this tenant architecture and how like at least I was approaching it, whether it was like totally stupid or not?
I would love for
Um,
you to go through it.
yeah, so um, like keep in mind that I had scoped this out with Nick a couple months ago, when things were very new, and so it might not be the best of the best. Um, but essentially, there were a lot of different like players here. One of which was, so going all the way back to the beginning, was the Hyperverse service, um, and this contract was really supposed to deal with like payments and stuff. So this is like that monetizable contract, and this handles like, you know, how things will be deposited to auditors, how things will be deposited to developers, to the Decentrology vault, stuff like that. So you'll see this like very early version of the contract, stores some sample stuff like a Decentrology vault, and like a current Hyperverse fee. So this is like represented in basis points, and essentially what this is like if you had a transaction that minted an NFT that costed like $10, if a tenant wanted to use this composable contract, they would have to pay a certain fee to the Hyperverse module owner, and so this is kind of like representing that percentages. Anyway, it's a bunch of confusing stuff. Essentially, it was just a contract that handled the payment, which is not too important right now, since we're kind of leaving the payment to the side. But the most important thing that comes out of here that's really important for now is something called an Auth Nft. And the idea here was that if any tenant, right, and a tenant is someone that uses composable smart contracts, so any tenant that wanted to interact with the Hyperverse would have to call into the Hyperverse service and get what's called an Auth Nft. And this Auth NFT would almost represent that tenant's identity in the whole Hyperverse system. So if they went to a composable subscription contract, or if they went to a composable NFT contract, or if they went to a composable marketplace contract, they would have to have this one Auth NFT and pass that into the composable smart contracts to say, hey, I've registered with the Hyperverse service. I'm a member of the Hyperverse service, and here's my Auth NFT.
And that's something that lives, for example, in the account storage on Flow.
In account storage, exactly. And part of the reason for this was because we wanted to have some sort of way to handle payment. And so the initial vision for that was each Auth NFT would require you to have a Flow token vault. And so essentially inside the composable smart contract, like I'll show you this is an example of one. When you actually call, and I'll go over this in a second again, but when you actually like initially like get a tenant resource or like you register with this composable contract, you'll see it's requiring that you pass in an Auth NFT. So it's essentially saying like in order to be a tenant and to own your own data from this composable smart contract, you have to have registered with the Hyperverse and you have to have this Auth NFT.
And what are the properties of that Auth NFT? Can you show us that again?
Yeah. So the properties of the Auth NFT, which
is an address,
are keep in mind are very primitive right now, but it's an address, right? So this is like your address, and a Flow token vault. There's also a bunch of other stuff here that I commented out because it's crucially important, but like a fixed charge and a dynamic charge, and what these were here, I'll just uncomment these just so we can see them. Oh crap! Wait. Oh well, it looks like I got rid of the functionality, but what this was doing is it was like fixed charge was just taking the Auth NFT's Flow token vault and just charging it with the price that the composable smart contract owner had defined for that function. So it was taking in a contract metadata and a function name, and it was going into this contract metadata, looking for this function name and saying, okay, that person had specified it was 10 Flow token. So it was just charging that on the Flow token vault. But again, like I really don't want to get into payments here because it's so messed up and like doesn't make any sense. So it's just like let's just skip that for now. And I'm sure like you'll have much better ideas than me on that anyway. But anyway, you pass in the yeah.
So when we call this instance this seems like a weird place for a noun for a function. Like is it get instance? Is it create instance? The intent is probably to create a tenant. So
yep.
Then we would probably need a better name. But so this takes in an Auth NFT, which uniquely identifies an account, and it returns a tenant. Now, what's a tenant in terms of the structure?
Yeah. So a tenant, if a tenant, like the actual necessities of it, come from this contract interface. So this contract interface, we call the Hyperverse interface, has to be implemented by any composable smart contract out there. So if you have a composable smart contract, it must implement this Hyperverse interface. And one of the components of that was this tenant. So the two required fields of a tenant are an ID, which is like a unique ID that represents this tenant, and each composable smart contracts, like total tenants, starts at 0, and it increments. So like if you've worked with like NFT contracts before, there's like a total supply, and each NFT has its own ID. Very similar, right? So in this case, like the tenant was like that NFT, and this is like the total supply almost. So that's how you would kind of, this was I added this in response to a problem where you could accidentally take one person's tenant, interact with that, and then, for example, like take an NFT that was minted by that tenant and give it to another tenant's ecosystem, which isn't good. And we wanted a way to like, uniquely identify each tenant's ecosystem, and so that's why we're requiring this ID. And then the second thing is like that a capability to that Auth NFT. So if I, Jacob, wanted to go to a subscription contract and I wanted to own my own data to have like my own little ecosystem, I would get my Auth Nft, and remember, that's only once ever. So once I have my Auth Nft, I never have to do that again. And then I register with the subscription contract. I pass in my Auth Nft, I get my tenant, and boom, now I own my own data. And so as an example, like inside this subscription contract, here are the 2 required fields. I'm going to delete these for now. And then here's all my own data. So this is all data that would usually be at the contract level, but because of the composable architecture, it's now within this tenant, so that I own my own data, and whoever wants to interact with my ecosystem would do that through my tenant.
And where do we store? What's the URL for tenants?
So tenants are also stored in account storage. And I'm not sure if I specified like an exact path name. No, I didn't. So there's no like defined. Are you talking about like a storage path,
yeah,
like a public path?
Yeah. So what would be a storage path? Because that to me seems like a real concern. Obviously, these differ per contract, but if you think about someone as a third party, and I want to identify which modules does this account have tenants with, where would I look?
Yep. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And one of the things that I was actually thinking about, I just never got around to doing, was inside this like interface that specifies like you need to have a tenant. I was thinking of maybe adding a storage path so that each composable contract had to like define a storage path where that tenant would lie.
That would be the only solution, because one individual module can only have a single type of tenant, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, then that's where you would put it. You would put the storage path in any kind of other path, like a public path. If we want to provide some public interfaces, would be stored out in the path. And when we so we create this resource, right? We create the tenant resource, we pass it, and where do we consume it?
Well, actually, hold on. So one before I forget about this, now I'm kind of thinking about, there's problems of like overlap with these storage paths now, because if I want to get a tenant from a subscription contract and the path name is /storage/Jacob, right? And then I go to an NFT composable contract and the path name is /storage/Jacob. Now I'm screwed.
That's true. So we need to, as part of the registry, and if we go back to the metadata, we need to carve out a unique storage path for the tenant. So it would be above external, it would be pub var tenant storage path prefix, or it might even be the whole thing. So tenant storage path, and it would be of type storage path.
Yeah. So
lowercase
so
t.
Now so this is interesting now, because well, there's an issue with this, because I think this would make sense as like a prefix almost, and I'll explain why, and we can go back if not. But there's a possibility that there's multiple tenants per module, right? Because a module can have both a subscription contract and like I don't know, some time utility, right? So I guess that's a bad example, but like, what if like a module had both a composable NFT contract and a composable marketplace contract?
Then you would store them as separate. So this is kind of a limitation of what you can do with a secondary module. Otherwise, we need to ensure uniqueness, right? And we can't ensure uniqueness if upon registration we can't provide an answer whether this is taken or not. And if it's a prefix,
That
then
yeah.
we can't tell it if it's taken or not because we don't know what comes after the prefix.
Well, maybe the prefix, but maybe the prefix could be some uniquely generated like hash of 8 numbers, or like, I'm just gonna spam my keyboard for a second, right? So what if it was this, and this was generated every time that someone, and this also ties into the submission process of a module, but every time it was submitted, a unique prefix was generated. And this would ensure uniqueness, because now any tenant that you have would always begin with this prefix, and then, I don't know, you would name it like NFT.
Right, but
Like,
when
yeah.
when working with the contract, and especially when examining someone's storage, you would see a lot of gibberish as far as the storage paths go. So just generating something randomly seems inefficient in terms of readability. Like we want to have meaning behind everything, and I would say that if you want to have multiple tenants for a single module, then maybe this would be tenant storage paths, and it would be an array of storage paths.
Yeah. Or you were also talking about before how each module is specifically different in that their title, the combination
exactly.
of their title,
look.
version, and so that's the prefix, right? It would be title, version.
No.
This obviously whatever.
So going back, so let's say this is all right. Yeah, this makes total sense now. So if you were to leave a tenant storage path and make that into a storage path right now,
Yep.
And we can then explore what it is to be a secondary module. So for a secondary module, that module will also implement Hyperverse module. It will it will have the module metadata struct. It will initialize a module metadata struct, and it will also initialize a tenant. So the primary module sets whatever tenant storage path it needs, and then every secondary module sets a tenant storage path that it needs.
Yeah.
So and we don't need to account for a prefix or anything like that, because if you have secondary modules that do have tenants, then they will define this field.
So then how do we ensure uniqueness between modules? Right?
So we ensure uniqueness by telling this is kind of like, how do we ensure that jacob.com is taken or not? We look it up. And if it's taken, then tough luck, you got to pick something else. And the only way to do that is to go to the Hyperverse search index and see what is your tenant storage path taken or not.
Okay.
And this is,
so you're saying,
and this is by the way, sorry for interjecting, but this is a smarter system than what currently exists for Flow, because that's a major issue. Like if I create artist path, for example, or whatever, like a common noun, someone else might already have it. I have no clue until I deploy it, I add it to an account, and then I'm
yeah. Like you only know unless you actually try it and it says no.
Yeah, which is a terrible way to test this out. And whereas we would establish like a global reference to storage path names that are taken.
Okay, got it. So you're saying that instead of actually having that uniqueness inside the contract, there would just be some sort of thing on the front end that would, or some global reference that would tell you whether or not that's taken ahead of time. Okay, cool.
Because we can't establish uniqueness any other way, because even a random number couldn't, there's no guarantee that it would not occur again someplace else, and whereas a check would solve that problem.
Yeah. And before we move on, so there's just two other things I want to throw out there, just in case you're like, oh my god, that's great. So one thing that I was thinking is maybe you have like an ID here. Just totally throwing this out there. So maybe each module would have an ID, and then it would be prefixed by that ID, something like that. Not sure.
But
Do you have any thoughts on that?
semantically, a storage path acts the same way as an ID.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing is,
yeah, you're right. Yeah, in this case,
it's a unique identifier. ID is a number that's a unique identifier. A tenant storage path is a string that's a unique identifier. And we might as well sort of, if you add a comment above it, we could enforce a schema for like how do you create a storage path? Well, you can do reverse domain, like for example, for a deontology subscription module, you could have com dot deontology dot subscription, a reverse domain. This is something that Android uses for their, like when you're creating an app for the Android App Store. How do you define its uniqueness? You use a reverse domain name, and you're sort of working with the existing domain name system to ensure uniqueness, like, and you don't have to,
Yep. Cool. And the other thing that I just want to bring up is, so, obviously we're using this module metadata for both the primary and secondary exports, so that if a secondary export wanted to be exported, right, or if it wanted to be deemed a secondary export, it would have to implement this Hyperverse module. Yep. So it would need this metadata, and it would have to define a tenant storage path. Yep. But what about the case where that, like, let's say this composable contract isn't a secondary export? Then how do we specify the storage path here?
Well, if it's not a secondary export, then it just uses the primary export's tenant. BZ's got to go.
But
bye, BZ. Nice having you.
Bye, BZ. Bye, BZ. But the issue here is that there could be multiple tenants per module. So if you had a module that had 3 composable contracts in it, and none of them were secondary exports, you'd essentially have 3 different tenants, right, for each one.
Well, why would you have 3 different tenants?
Because the tenant is unique to the contract itself, because the tenant represents the data of that contract that you want to be unique.
Right. So if you have only a primary export, right? You don't have any.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, you're right. You're totally right. Yeah.
Then 100%. You have a tenant, a singular tenant, and all the other ones use that primary contract tenant.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Because, like, anything that's associated with that contract goes with that tenant. You can add however much you want in terms of what you associate with a singular tenant, and it would only make sense to create a different tenant if it's something that you could export.
So you're saying that if you had a module with 3 composable contracts in it, you would right? So you had the primary, and then 3 and then 3 composable contracts that weren't not secondary exports, right? You would just have one tenant that had the information for each of those.
Yep. Okay. Because those 3 end up being imported into the primary contract, and their functionality is leveraged within the primary contract to create the primary interface with which the developer will use that contract. So that is the place where you would interact with the tenant as well. Whereas those secondary non-module contracts, they would just be like, I'm calculating, the square root of pi or whatever. I don't need a tenant. Like, not on that kind of level.
Yep. And then, so we only have 5 minutes left, but this was awesome, by the way. But so
if we were to go back to the tenant a little bit, and I want to see where do we put the resource once we create it? That instance function that we call.
Oh yeah, so that's at the transaction level. So you would, at the transaction level, you store it in your account storage. So you run a transaction called, get instance, and that's how you get it.
And then the storage is left at that point. It is an implementation detail that we haven't defined yet, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so this would take care of that, where we would essentially store it in the account storage.
Yeah. And so one other thing before we move on, so let's think about the case where we have a module, we have those three composable smart contracts, like I said before, but one of them is a secondary export, right? So in that case scenario, we have a primary export
With a tenant storage path?
With a tenant storage path, right? And in that case scenario, it's holding the data for both for the two that are not secondary exports, right?
Yeah.
But what do you do then with the third secondary export that does have its own tenant storage path? How do you include that in the primary export? Like, how do you incorporate that?
Well, I would argue that you only have one tenant per module, but it would not make sense if it's something that people can export and has fees and whatnot. So then within the primary export, you interact with your secondary. So like whatever, let's call this secondary tenant storage path, secondary tenant, and you interact with those within the primary.
So essentially, that primary export's tenant would still store all the data.
No.
With stuff that interacts with the secondary, right?
I mean, it's an option, but it's not as clean, and there's some duplication involved. So I think they would just coexist, right? If you have two tenants, then you have two tenants, and then you just define their interactions. But their interactions would be defined within the primary export for sure.
Yep. All right, yeah. So this was a great discussion. I'm really, really curious as to how this is actually going to work in Kadence code, because there's a lot there for sure. Between like access account, access contract, like all these access modifiers, and trying to keep everything secure but also readable. It's going to be interesting to explore.
Absolutely, and we need to hit the road ASAP to see. We're deliberating things that are in the clouds a little bit, and we need to see live ASAP. So we're sort of making some assumptions that might not be the best assumptions, but they're the ones that move us closest to a test. So I think for the next one, we need to redefine a tenant interface, and sort of strip it down to the bare bones.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I like that. I think next time we hit the road with this like Hyperverse interface to try and go over like what exactly this tenant really is.
And in terms of what it really is, just a like an executive summary, it is a way for us to identify a unique account within a single Hyperverse module. And that will be used for fees, primarily fees, right?
Yeah, and data and all that stuff.
Data too. All right, so then, yeah, and that contract itself just leverages those tenants, and yeah. So this is a big point of discussion, and having a concrete thing that we use a tenant for would be good. So for the next one, just. Man, I want to think about something like a simple contract.
Let's just do an NFT or something.
Let's maybe even simpler than maybe just a token, a fungible token.
Yeah. Yeah, because this subscription one is not something to start with. We can introduce it in the future when we get more complicated. But yeah.
All right, so for our next yet to be scheduled committee, Hyperverse Plan Committee number 2, we'll do a fungible token implementation with a tenant. All right, thanks, Jacob, for
thank you, Morgan,
and thanks anyone that joined us, and we'll catch you in the next one. Bye now.
Bye.
Stream is in.